Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, a place where we explore global ideas using clear and simple English, and where learning happens through calm discussion, thoughtful explanations, and meaningful conversation. So wherever you are listening from today, we are very glad to have you with us as we begin an important and interesting topic that helps us understand how the modern world works beyond headlines and conflicts.
Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today, because the topic we are discussing is not only about international relations, but also about how influence works quietly in our daily lives. And today's discussion is designed especially for English learners who want to improve listening skills while also learning something useful about the world around them.
Our topic today is called China's Silent Power, Influence Without War. And this subject is important because when people hear the word power, they often imagine military strength or conflict. But in reality, much of today's global influence happens without violence, without battles, and without force, which means understanding silent power helps us understand modern relationships between countries in a more realistic and balanced way.
This topic also matters because we live in a connected world, where decisions made in one country can affect education, business, technology, and communication in many other places. So learning how influence works peacefully allows listeners to think more clearly, avoid misunderstanding, and develop a deeper perception of global interaction.
Before we continue, dear listeners, if you find this kind of educational content helpful, we kindly ask you to support the English Globe by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because your support helps us continue creating calm, informative podcasts designed especially for English learners around the world.
We would also love to hear from you, so please tell us in the comments where you are listening from today, and feel free to share your opinion about this topic, because learning becomes more meaningful when ideas are shared and different perspectives are respected in a thoughtful and positive way.
Now, let us begin by understanding what the term silent power really means, because this expression can sound abstract at first, but once it is explained clearly, it becomes much easier to understand. And silent power refers to the ability of a country to influence others through attraction, cooperation, and long-term presence, rather than through fear or force.
For English learners, it is helpful to focus on key abstract nouns here, such as influence, strategy, presence, and perception, because these words describe ideas rather than physical objects, and they are often used when people talk about politics, education, culture, and international relationships.
Silent power works slowly, and that is why it is often more stable than military power, because when influence is built through trust, shared interests, and consistent behavior, other countries may choose cooperation willingly, and as a result, relationships become stronger over time instead of breaking under pressure.
So the main difference between military power and influence-based power is the method, because military power uses strength to change behavior quickly, while silent power uses communication, credibility, and shared benefits, which means people and governments feel less pressure and more motivation to work together.
This explains why many countries today prefer influence instead of force, because force often creates resistance, fear, and long-term damage, while influence encourages dialogue, learning, and adaptation, and because the modern world depends heavily on trade, education, and technology, peaceful influence becomes a more effective strategy.
For listeners learning English, it is useful to notice the cause and effect structure in these ideas, because when countries are economically connected, conflict becomes costly, and because conflict is costly, influence becomes more attractive. So understanding this logical flow also helps improve comprehension skills.
In simple words, silent power shapes decisions without shouting, without threatening, and without controlling, and instead, it works through ideas, systems, and relationships, which makes it one of the most important concepts for understanding how the world operates today.
As we move forward in this podcast, we will continue to explore this idea step by step, using clear language and real-world explanations, so listeners can improve their English while also gaining a calm and balanced understanding of global influence in the modern age.
When we look at the modern world carefully, we can see that influence matters more than conflict today, not because conflict has disappeared, but because the global system has changed so deeply that force often creates more problems than solutions, and therefore many countries now prefer strategies that focus on cooperation, trust, and long-term relationships instead of confrontation.
That idea becomes much clearer when we connect it to everyday life, because in our personal relationships, people usually achieve better results through communication rather than argument, and in a similar way, countries today often gain more benefits through influence than through conflict, especially because they depend on each other in many practical ways.
One of the most important reasons for this change is economic interdependence, because countries are now connected through trade, supply chains, and shared markets. So when one economy is damaged by conflict, others are affected as well, and as a result, war becomes less useful and cooperation becomes more valuable.
This is similar to how people depend on each other at work, because if one person causes problems, the whole team can suffer. So working together is usually more effective than competing aggressively. And this everyday example helps learners understand why economic connections reduce the desire for conflict.
Exactly, Julia. And because economies are connected, influence becomes more powerful than force. Since trust encourages investment, stability supports growth, and predictable behavior attracts partners. Therefore, countries that appear reliable often gain more long-term advantages than those that rely on pressure.
Another change that makes influence more important is global media and information flow, because today information moves faster than ever, and people around the world can see events, reactions, and decisions almost instantly, which means actions are observed, discussed, and remembered by global audiences.
That is a very important point, because when information flows quickly, reputation becomes easier to build, but also easier to damage. So countries must consider how their actions are perceived internationally. And because perception shapes trust, influence becomes closely connected to image and communication.
For English learners, this can be understood by thinking about social media. Because when someone behaves respectfully online, others may trust them more. But when someone behaves aggressively, people may avoid them. And in the same way, countries are influenced by how they are seen globally.
As a result of this media environment, influence often works better than conflict, because cooperation creates positive stories, while conflict often creates negative attention, and therefore governments increasingly consider how decisions will be interpreted beyond their borders.
This leads naturally to the idea of reputation and trust between countries, because trust is not built quickly, but once it exists, it makes cooperation easier, while conflict often destroys trust and takes many years to repair.
Yes, and trust functions like a foundation, because when countries trust each other, agreements are easier to make, communication becomes smoother, and misunderstandings are reduced, so influence grows stronger, whereas conflict weakens relationships and creates uncertainty.
In daily life, we usually listen more to people we trust than to people who threaten us. And this comparison helps learners understand why influence feels more effective than force, especially in a world where long-term cooperation matters more than short-term control.
Therefore, many countries today choose influence instead of conflict, not because influence is weaker, but because it is often more sustainable, more predictable, and less damaging, which makes it a practical choice in a complex global system.
For listeners learning English, it is useful to notice comparative language here, such as influence being more effective than conflict, or trust being more valuable than pressure, because these comparisons help express balanced opinions without strong persuasion.
And by using linking words like because, therefore, and as a result, learners can clearly explain ideas and show logical connections, which is an important skill not only for language learning, but also for critical thinking.
In this section, the key idea is not that conflict has disappeared, but that influence now plays a larger role. Because the world is more connected, information moves faster, and trust creates opportunities that force often destroys.
This understanding helps us see modern international relations in a calmer and more realistic way, and it prepares listeners to explore how different countries, including China, use influence quietly to shape outcomes without relying on conflict. When we talk about economic presence as a form of power, we are talking about how long-term economic relationships are created, maintained, and expanded over time. Because influence in the modern world is often built through trade, investment, and cooperation, rather than through sudden actions or direct pressure.
So, if I understand correctly, economic presence means that a country becomes important in the daily economic life of other countries. And because businesses, jobs, and development are connected to that presence, influence is created naturally and gradually instead of being forced.
That is exactly right, Julia. And one of the most common ways this happens is through trade partnerships, because when countries exchange goods and services regularly, mutual dependence is created. And as a result, communication becomes more frequent, and cooperation is often preferred over disagreement.
This can be understood easily by thinking about local markets, because when people buy from the same shop regularly, trust is built over time. And in a similar way, when countries trade consistently, reliability and stability are valued more than short-term advantage.
In international trade partnerships, supply chains are connected, contracts are signed, and standards are followed, so economic relationships become structured and predictable. And because these systems take time to build, they encourage long-term thinking instead of sudden confrontation.
For English learners, it is useful to notice that in these explanations, passive voice is often used, such as goods are exchanged, agreements are signed, and systems are connected. Because this formal style is common in business and economic discussions.
Another important part of economic presence is investment and infrastructure cooperation, because when roads are built, factories are established, or energy systems are supported through international cooperation, the economic connection becomes visible and long-lasting.
This means that infrastructure is not only a physical structure, but also a sign of partnership. Because when something is built to support trade or development, it shows commitment, and that commitment often creates influence over many years.
Yes, and infrastructure projects are usually designed for long-term use, which means planning is shared, maintenance is required, and coordination is continued. So influence grows quietly as cooperation becomes part of everyday economic activity.
From a learning perspective, listeners can observe business-related vocabulary here, such as investment, cooperation, development, and infrastructure. Because these words are frequently used in formal discussions about economics and international relations.
Long-term economic presence is especially important because it creates stability, and when stability is provided, trust is strengthened, and as a result, countries often prefer to protect these economic relationships rather than risk them through conflict.
This is similar to long-term employment, because when someone works in the same organization for many years, relationships are formed, systems are understood, and influence is gained through experience rather than authority.
Exactly, Julia. And because economic presence develops slowly, it is often less visible than military power. But it can be more effective, because decisions are influenced through shared interests, ongoing cooperation, and mutual benefit.
So, to summarize for our listeners, economic power today is not only about how much money a country has, but about how deeply it is connected to others through trade, investment, and infrastructure that is built to last.
That summary is very accurate, because when economies are connected over time, influence is created through systems rather than pressure. And this explains why economic presence has become one of the most important forms of power in the modern global environment.
For English learners, this section also shows how formal descriptive language is used to explain complex ideas calmly, without emotional words or strong opinions, which is helpful for both language learning and clear communication.
Understanding economic presence as a form of power allows us to see global influence in a more practical and realistic way, because it reminds us that many important decisions are shaped not by force, but by long-term economic cooperation that supports growth and stability.
When we talk about education and cultural exchange, what immediately comes to my mind is curiosity, because students who travel to another country to study are not only learning subjects like science, business, or history, but they are also observing daily habits, communication styles, and social values. And this learning experience often stays with them for life, shaping how they think, how they speak, and how they understand the country that hosted them.
That curiosity is exactly where influence begins, because student exchange programs are designed to create long-term understanding rather than short-term results. And when students live, study, and interact in a new academic environment, trust is gradually built, relationships are formed naturally, and positive perceptions are developed, which later influence professional cooperation, academic partnerships, and even diplomatic communication.
From a learner's perspective, student exchange programs are powerful because education feels personal. Since friendships are formed in classrooms, ideas are shared during group projects, and daily life experiences are discussed openly, which means the influence created through education is often emotional, memorable, and deeply connected to real human experiences rather than official messages.
This is why education is often described as a soft but effective tool of influence, because when universities are respected, degrees are recognized, and academic systems are trusted, students choose them voluntarily, and as a result, the country providing education becomes associated with quality, opportunity, and intellectual development in the minds of future professionals.
Language learning and cultural centers also play an important role here, because when people learn a language, they do not only memorize vocabulary or grammar, but they also learn how people think, how humor works, and how emotions are expressed, which creates a deeper cultural connection and reduces misunderstanding between different societies.
Exactly, and cultural centers are often created to support this process, because they provide structured environments where language is taught, traditions are explained, and cultural activities are shared, so influence is built through education, art, and communication instead of pressure, and this influence grows steadily as more learners participate.
For English learners listening to us, it is helpful to notice descriptive adjectives such as academic, cultural, international, and educational, because these words are often used when discussing learning environments, exchange programs, and global cooperation, and they help describe ideas clearly and formally.
Media, films, and cultural exposure also support this form of influence, because movies, television programs, and digital content introduce audiences to lifestyles, values, and social behavior. And when this exposure feels relatable and authentic, curiosity is encouraged and cultural distance is reduced.
Many people first learn about another country through films or online content, and this exposure often creates interest before any direct contact happens, which shows how culture can influence perception quietly, emotionally, and effectively without formal instruction.
When education, language learning, and cultural media work together, a long-term presence is created in people's minds, because ideas feel familiar, communication feels easier, and cooperation feels natural, which explains why culture-based influence is often more sustainable than influence created through force or pressure.
So, to summarize for our listeners, education and culture shape global influence by creating understanding, familiarity, and trust. And because these elements develop slowly through learning and experience, they tend to last longer and feel more genuine than direct persuasion.
This section shows us that global influence is not always loud or visible, because sometimes it grows quietly in classrooms, language centers, and cultural stories, where learning becomes the bridge that connects societies and shapes the future in a peaceful and constructive way. When we discuss technology as a form of influence, it is important to understand that technology does not operate like traditional power, because instead of controlling territory or using force, it shapes how people communicate, how businesses operate, and how societies function on a daily basis. And because technology becomes part of everyday life, its influence often grows quietly and steadily without creating tension or conflict.
That explanation is helpful, Adam, because for many learners, technology can sound abstract or complicated, so it may be useful to define it clearly. Since in this context, technology refers to digital tools, systems, platforms, and innovations that support communication, data exchange, transportation, energy, and information management across countries.
Exactly, Julia. And one of the most important ways technology creates influence is through technology partnerships. Because when countries cooperate on research, software development, or digital solutions, shared systems are created. And once these systems are adopted, they become difficult to replace, which means long-term cooperation is encouraged.
So, if I understand correctly, technology partnerships work step by step, because first an agreement is made, then systems are developed together. After that, training is provided, and finally the technology becomes part of daily operations, which means influence grows naturally through use rather than through pressure.
That step-by-step process is very accurate, and because these partnerships are often built on efficiency and practicality, they feel neutral and useful rather than political, which makes them more acceptable to many countries that want development without conflict.
For English learners, it is useful to notice technology-related vocabulary here, such as digital systems, platforms, innovation, data, and infrastructure, because these words are commonly used in modern academic and professional discussions.
Another key element is digital infrastructure, which includes internet networks, data centers, communication systems, and cloud services. And when this infrastructure is built or supported through international cooperation, it becomes the foundation for education, business, healthcare, and government services.
Digital infrastructure may sound technical, but it can be explained simply because it works like roads and bridges in the digital world, allowing information to move quickly and efficiently. And once people rely on these systems, trust in the provider naturally increases.
That is a very useful comparison, because just as physical infrastructure connects cities, digital infrastructure connects people and institutions. And when these systems are reliable and secure, long-term relationships are strengthened through daily dependence.
From a learning perspective, listeners should notice how passive voice is used here, such as systems are built, networks are connected, and services are supported, because this style is very common when describing technical processes formally.
Technology also shapes influence through the setting of international standards, which means technical rules, formats, and guidelines are agreed upon so that systems can work together smoothly across borders.
This part can sound complex, so it may help to explain that standards decide how devices communicate, how data is stored, and how systems interact. And once a standard is widely used, it becomes the normal way of doing things.
Exactly, and because standards are adopted by companies, governments, and institutions, influence is created quietly, since everyone who follows the same standard becomes part of a shared system that supports cooperation and efficiency.
So influence here is not about control, but about coordination. Because when countries use the same standards, cooperation becomes easier, costs are reduced, and compatibility is improved.
That is an important point, because technology influence often appears neutral and technical, but over time it shapes decisions, habits, and expectations, which is why it is considered a powerful form of silent influence.
For English learners, defining terms clearly is essential. So when we say innovation, we mean the development of new ideas or methods. And when we say digital standards, we mean agreed technical rules that guide how systems function together.
By explaining these ideas step by step, learners can see that technology influence grows through usefulness, reliability, and long-term integration rather than through conflict or force.
This also shows that modern influence is often invisible because people focus on convenience and efficiency, not on who created the system. Yet over time, familiarity creates trust.
Therefore, technology, innovation, and global standards together form a quiet but effective way of shaping the modern world, because they connect societies through systems that support daily life and long-term cooperation.
For our listeners, the key idea to remember is that technology influence is powerful precisely because it feels normal, practical, and helpful, which makes it one of the most effective tools of influence in today's interconnected world.
Understanding this helps learners see how influence without conflict works in reality, because it shows that power in the modern world is often built through systems, knowledge, and shared solutions rather than confrontation.
When people think about countries they have never visited, their ideas usually come from news reports, documentaries, films, or online platforms. So I often wonder how much of our understanding of the world is shaped by media rather than direct experience, and whether this makes media presence one of the most important tools for forming a global image.
That reflection is very relevant, Julia, because international media presence plays a major role in shaping how countries are perceived, since media does not only report events, but also selects topics, frames stories, and decides which details are emphasized. And as a result, audiences around the world form impressions based on repeated exposure to certain narratives.
For learners listening to us, it might help to explain what we mean by international media presence, because this term includes global news agencies, international broadcasting, digital platforms, and even social media content that reaches audiences beyond national borders.
Exactly. And when a country has a consistent presence in international media, its actions, culture, and policies become more familiar, and familiarity often reduces misunderstanding, because people tend to trust what they understand better than what feels distant or unknown.
This makes me think about storytelling, because media does not only share facts, but also tells stories. And stories are powerful because they help people remember information, connect emotionally, and create meaning, even when the topic is complex.
That is an important observation, because storytelling is central to how national images are shaped, since stories present a country through themes such as development, innovation, tradition, or cooperation. And when these themes are repeated over time, they influence public perception gradually and quietly.
So, public perception is not formed in one moment, but through continuous exposure. And this explains why narratives matter more than single events, because people usually remember patterns rather than details.
Yes, and narratives influence opinions not by forcing agreement, but by providing context, explanations, and familiar reference points, so audiences feel they understand a situation even if they have never experienced it directly.
For English learners, it may be helpful to notice media-related vocabulary here, such as coverage, audience, narrative, platform, and perception, because these words are commonly used when discussing how information is shared globally.
Another important aspect is tone, because the way information is presented matters, and a neutral tone focuses on describing events, reporting statements, and presenting multiple perspectives without emotional language, which helps maintain credibility and trust.
This is especially important for sensitive topics, because when language is balanced and descriptive, audiences are more likely to listen carefully and think critically instead of reacting emotionally.
As a result, countries that communicate through calm and consistent messaging often build a stable image over time, because clarity supports understanding, and understanding supports trust.
It is interesting that public perception can influence relationships, because when people feel familiar with a country through media, cooperation feels less distant and dialogue feels more possible.
That is true, and this shows how media works as a bridge, connecting societies through information, stories, and shared experiences, even when physical contact is limited.
For learners, this section also demonstrates how reporting language is used, because instead of giving opinions, we describe processes, explain patterns, and observe outcomes, which is a useful skill for both academic and professional communication.
Understanding media, narratives, and global image helps listeners see that influence often develops through communication rather than action, and through perception rather than pressure.
So the key idea here is that countries shape their image internationally by being present in media, by sharing stories consistently, and by communicating in a way that audiences can understand and remember.
And by recognizing how narratives influence opinions, learners can become more informed listeners, more careful readers, and more confident English users in a media-rich world. When we speak about diplomacy, we are referring to a method of communication and cooperation that operates quietly and patiently over time, because diplomacy is not designed to produce immediate results through pressure, but rather to build understanding, manage differences, and create stable relationships through dialogue, respect, and consistent interaction between countries.
When you describe it like that, Adam, diplomacy sounds very similar to human relationships, because in our personal lives, strong connections are usually built through conversation, listening, and compromise, rather than through forceful behavior. And this comparison makes the idea of diplomacy feel more natural and easier to understand.
That comparison is very accurate, Julia, because diplomacy functions on the same principles as long-term human relationships, where trust is developed gradually, misunderstandings are resolved through discussion, and cooperation becomes stronger when both sides feel respected and heard over time.
For English learners, it may be helpful to notice that diplomatic language often sounds formal and polite, because phrases such as mutual understanding, constructive dialogue, and shared interests are commonly used to maintain a respectful tone and to keep communication open, even when opinions differ.
Exactly. And this polite and formal language is not accidental, because diplomacy depends on dialogue rather than confrontation, and when dialogue is maintained, cooperation remains possible, which helps prevent disagreements from turning into serious conflicts.
This makes me think about how disagreements between friends or colleagues are often resolved more successfully when people talk calmly and listen carefully, instead of reacting emotionally. And this everyday example helps explain why dialogue is such an important part of international diplomacy.
Dialogue allows countries to express concerns, clarify intentions, and explore solutions together. And because these conversations are often ongoing rather than temporary, diplomacy creates channels of communication that remain active even during difficult periods.
So diplomacy is not a single meeting or agreement, but a continuous process, where communication is maintained over months and years. And this long-term nature explains why diplomacy is often described as patient and strategic rather than dramatic.
That is correct. And this leads us naturally to the idea of long-term partnerships, because diplomacy is most effective when relationships are sustained over time, allowing cooperation to expand gradually in areas such as trade, education, security, and cultural exchange.
Long-term partnerships feel similar to long-term friendships because once trust is established, cooperation becomes easier, expectations are clearer, and misunderstandings are handled more calmly, which shows how stability grows from consistent interaction.
In international relations, long-term partnerships are built through repeated cooperation, reliable behavior, and respect for agreements. And when these elements are present, countries are more willing to work together and less likely to act in ways that damage the relationship.
For listeners learning English, relationship-based vocabulary, such as partnership, cooperation, trust, commitment, and dialogue, is very important, because these words appear frequently in formal discussions about diplomacy and global cooperation.
Another important aspect of diplomacy is regional cooperation, because countries that share borders or common challenges often benefit from working together, especially in areas like trade, transportation, environmental protection, and public health.
This can be compared to neighborhoods, because people living close to each other usually need clear communication and cooperation to solve shared problems. And the same principle applies at the regional level between countries.
Regional cooperation often creates frameworks where dialogue is regular, expectations are defined, and joint solutions are explored, which helps reduce tension and supports long-term stability within a region.
Beyond regions, diplomacy also supports global cooperation, because many challenges today, such as climate issues, economic stability, and technological development, require countries to communicate and coordinate at an international level.
Global cooperation depends heavily on diplomatic relationships, because international organizations, agreements, and forums rely on dialogue, negotiation, and compromise rather than authority or force, which shows how diplomacy functions as a foundation of the global system.
For English learners, it is useful to notice how polite expressions are used in these contexts, such as expressing concern, offering cooperation, and seeking understanding, because these phrases help maintain respectful communication in both formal and professional settings.
Diplomacy is powerful precisely because it is quiet, since its success is measured not by attention or headlines, but by stability, continuity, and the ability to manage differences without escalation.
This reminds us that influence does not always need to be visible to be effective, because strong relationships often work in the background, supporting cooperation and preventing conflict before it becomes serious.
When countries invest in diplomacy, they invest in communication channels, trust-building measures, and long-term engagement, and these investments often produce lasting benefits that are not immediately visible but are deeply important.
So, from a human perspective, diplomacy teaches us that listening, patience, and respect are not signs of weakness, but tools for building strong and lasting relationships, whether between individuals or between nations.
Understanding diplomacy as a quiet but powerful tool helps learners see international relations in a calmer and more realistic way, because it shows that much of the world's stability depends on conversation, cooperation, and carefully maintained relationships rather than conflict.
For our listeners, the key idea is that diplomacy works slowly, politely, and consistently, and because of that, it plays a central role in shaping long-term partnerships, regional stability, and global cooperation.
By recognizing the value of diplomacy, English learners can also improve their own communication skills, because the same principles of respect, clarity, and patience apply to learning a language and building understanding across cultures.
When we talk about silent power, it is also important to ask how other countries respond to it, because reactions are not the same everywhere, and while some nations see silent influence as an opportunity for cooperation and shared growth, others view it more cautiously, which shows that global responses are complex and shaped by history, interests, and local priorities.
That is a very thoughtful way to introduce this topic, Julia, because responses to silent power are rarely simple or emotional, and instead they usually involve careful calculation, long-term planning, and ongoing evaluation, which is why it is important to describe these reactions in a balanced and neutral way rather than as positive or negative.
From one perspective, many countries choose cooperation, because cooperation often brings economic benefits, access to technology, educational opportunities, and infrastructure development. And when these advantages align with national goals, collaboration feels practical and mutually beneficial rather than risky.
However, while cooperation can be attractive, countries also consider competition, because influence in the global system is shared rather than unlimited, and therefore, governments often try to protect their own interests by strengthening domestic industries, investing in innovation, and maintaining decision-making independence.
This balance between cooperation and competition is interesting because although countries may work together in some areas, such as trade or education, they may still compete in others, such as technology development or market leadership, which shows that international relationships are rarely based on a single approach.
Exactly. And this mixed response highlights an important point for learners because it demonstrates that cooperation and competition can exist at the same time, and understanding this dual reality helps listeners avoid oversimplified views of global relations.
Another response we often see is adaptation, because instead of fully accepting or fully rejecting silent power, many countries adjust their policies, institutions, and strategies to respond in a way that fits their own needs and values.
Adaptation is a very common and practical response, because when countries observe new forms of influence, they often learn from them, improve their own systems, and adopt useful practices while maintaining control over national priorities.
For example, although a country may welcome foreign investment or technology, it may also develop regulations, standards, or local partnerships to ensure that cooperation remains balanced and sustainable over time.
This approach reflects critical thinking at the national level, because governments evaluate benefits and risks carefully, and as a result, influence is managed rather than accepted without question.
For English learners, it is helpful to notice contrast structures in this discussion, such as however, while, and although, because these words allow speakers to present different viewpoints clearly and calmly without sounding emotional or judgmental.
Yes, and balanced language is especially important when discussing global topics, because it helps describe reality accurately, showing that most international responses fall somewhere between acceptance and resistance, rather than at extreme positions.
Maintaining balance seems to be a key goal for many countries, because they want to benefit from global cooperation while also protecting sovereignty, cultural identity, and economic stability. And this careful balance requires continuous adjustment rather than fixed decisions.
Maintaining balance also means keeping multiple partnerships, diversifying economic relationships, and engaging in dialogue with different global actors, so that influence from one source does not become overwhelming or exclusive.
This reminds me of personal decision-making, because people often seek advice from different sources, compare perspectives, and then make choices that feel right for them, which makes the idea of national balance easier to understand.
That comparison is very useful, because it shows that countries, like individuals, evaluate options, consider consequences, and revise strategies as conditions change, which means responses to silent power are dynamic rather than fixed.
For learners practicing critical thinking expressions, phrases such as, "It can be argued that," from one point of view, and in contrast, help explain ideas thoughtfully and encourage listeners to reflect rather than react.
This section shows that silent power does not produce identical reactions, because global responses depend on context, priorities, and long-term goals. And understanding this diversity helps listeners develop a more realistic and informed view of international relations.
So the key idea for our listeners is that other countries respond to silent power through a combination of cooperation, competition, and adaptation, while continuously trying to maintain balance in a changing global environment.
By recognizing these varied responses and avoiding judgment, English learners can practice neutral analysis, improve academic discussion skills, and better understand how influence operates quietly across the world. When we look ahead to the future, it is important to consider how silent power and influence may shape the global landscape, because as countries continue to develop strategies based on cooperation, education, technology, and culture, it is possible that long-term partnerships could become even more important than traditional forms of power, and this may encourage nations to focus on dialogue, mutual understanding, and shared interests rather than confrontation or competition that risks instability.
That idea is very interesting, Adam, because it reminds me that in our daily lives, when people work together calmly and respectfully, they often achieve more sustainable outcomes than if they try to dominate or act aggressively. And in the same way, the world may move toward forms of interaction that value collaboration, long-term thinking, and balanced relationships over short-term advantage.
Exactly, Julia. And one aspect of this future scenario is that global cooperation could expand in areas such as science, education, public health, environmental protection, and technology development, because challenges like climate change, energy needs, and pandemics require collective solutions, and no single country can solve these issues alone, which makes collaboration both practical and necessary.
For learners listening, it is helpful to notice that predictive language like may, might, and could allows us to discuss possibilities without making definite statements, which is useful for both academic and conversational English, especially when talking about complex or uncertain future events.
Another potential development is peaceful competition, because while countries may continue to seek advantages in trade, technology, or culture, this competition might occur within frameworks of respect, transparency, and rule-based systems, which could help prevent conflict while still encouraging innovation, progress, and excellence in multiple areas.
I think that point also highlights the idea that not all competition is harmful, because constructive rivalry often pushes individuals or countries to improve, find new solutions, and develop stronger systems. And in the future, we might see more competition that is guided by ethical standards and shared goals rather than by domination or coercion.
Shared challenges may also become central to international relations, because as populations grow, resources are used more intensively, and global connectivity increases. Countries might find that addressing common problems together is more efficient and more beneficial than acting alone, which could encourage a sense of global responsibility and interdependence.
From a learning perspective, it is useful to notice future tense structures such as will, may, might, and could, as well as phrases like it is possible that or it is likely that, because these forms allow speakers to make predictions, express uncertainty, and discuss scenarios calmly and clearly.
In this context, silent power may become even more influential, because influence that is based on education, culture, technology, and diplomacy can create networks of trust and cooperation that persist over time, which could reduce the likelihood of conflict while increasing opportunities for shared development and understanding.
It is also interesting to consider that the next generation of leaders and citizens might be more globally aware because education, travel, digital communication, and cultural exchange provide exposure to multiple perspectives, which may encourage decision-making that prioritizes cooperation, empathy, and long-term outcomes.
That is a very important point, Julia, because global awareness can create a mindset where countries recognize their shared interests, respect differences, and approach problems with solutions that benefit both their own society and the international community, which could fundamentally change how influence is exercised in the future.
For English learners, noticing how soft modal verbs such as may, might, and could are used to present potential outcomes is helpful, because they allow speakers to remain neutral, thoughtful, and reflective while discussing possibilities that are not guaranteed.
In addition, this approach to future thinking encourages careful analysis, because considering multiple scenarios, examining potential consequences, and imagining different outcomes may lead to more informed and balanced decision-making at both national and personal levels.
So, to summarize, the future world may be shaped by a combination of cooperation, peaceful competition, and attention to shared challenges, because countries that focus on dialogue, education, technology, and culture could influence outcomes more effectively than those that rely solely on force or pressure.
This perspective helps learners see that the world's future may be guided by strategies that reward patience, understanding, and long-term planning. And it suggests that silent power, which operates through influence rather than confrontation, could play an increasingly important role in maintaining stability and promoting positive global relationships.
For our listeners, the key takeaway is that calm, thoughtful approaches to international relations, grounded in trust, collaboration, and shared responsibility, may lead to a world where influence is exercised constructively, challenges are addressed collectively, and cooperation becomes a foundation for sustainable progress.
By considering these possibilities, English learners can not only expand their vocabulary and grammar skills, but also develop a global mindset, learning to analyze situations critically, communicate ideas thoughtfully, and reflect on complex scenarios without rushing to judgment or relying on simplistic conclusions.
Ultimately, this forward-looking discussion reminds us that influence, education, culture, diplomacy, and cooperation are tools that may continue to shape the world in ways that are peaceful, productive, and sustainable. And that by paying attention to these patterns, listeners can better understand the subtle dynamics of international relationships and the potential for a more interconnected and harmonious future.
As we continue our exploration of silent power and influence, Julia, it is fascinating to consider not only how countries use these strategies internationally, but also how we might apply similar ideas in our everyday lives, because influence, trust, and cooperation are not limited to governments. They exist in personal relationships, schools, workplaces, and communities, and understanding these principles may help listeners improve communication, collaboration, and long-term outcomes in their own environments.
That is a very interesting perspective, Adam, because I think many learners may not immediately see the connection between global concepts like diplomacy, media narratives, and cultural exchange and their personal lives. But if we slow down and examine each idea, it becomes clear that the same principles can guide interactions, decision-making, and relationship building at home, at school, or even in online communities.
Exactly, Julia. For example, the concept of dialogue and careful communication, which is central to diplomacy, can be applied when we engage in discussions with classmates, colleagues, or friends, because patiently listening, asking clarifying questions, and expressing opinions respectfully often produces better results than rushing, arguing, or insisting on being right. And this mirrors how countries negotiate differences without resorting to conflict.
That makes a lot of sense, Adam. And just as nations build long-term partnerships, individuals can cultivate relationships over time by consistently showing reliability, helping others, and maintaining open communication. Because trust is rarely established instantly, and long-term cooperation often depends on repeated positive experiences that create familiarity and confidence.
Another practical application is the idea of adaptation, which we discussed earlier. In global relations, countries adapt policies or strategies to respond to changing circumstances. Similarly, in daily life, learners may face new challenges in school, work, or social situations, and adapting to those challenges by observing, learning, and adjusting behavior can lead to more successful outcomes while reducing misunderstandings and conflict.
For English learners, this also emphasizes the importance of being flexible in learning, because adapting study habits, trying new methods, and exploring diverse sources of English input, such as podcasts, news articles, or conversations, can help reinforce vocabulary, improve listening comprehension, and make the process more enjoyable and effective.
Exactly. Another concept we can apply personally is the role of reputation and perception, which is central to soft power, because the way others perceive us, our reliability, honesty, attitude, and willingness to cooperate, can influence how smoothly relationships develop. And maintaining a positive reputation often requires consistent actions, clear communication, and attention to how our behavior impacts others.
That is very practical, Adam. And we can link it to cultural understanding, which in international relations helps countries cooperate more effectively. On a personal level, Learning about other cultures, respecting differences, and showing curiosity rather than judgment can build stronger connections and make collaboration more enjoyable and productive, whether in multicultural classrooms, workplaces, or online communities.
Yes, Julia. And this also connects to language learning itself, because English is a global language, and understanding cultural context enhances comprehension, communication, and respect when speaking with people from different backgrounds. By practicing polite expressions, listening carefully, and noticing cultural references, learners can develop both language skills and social awareness simultaneously.
Another interesting lesson is the concept of influence through education and knowledge, which countries use to strengthen their global presence. On a personal level, learners can influence their peers or community positively by sharing knowledge, helping others understand concepts, or presenting ideas clearly and respectfully, and in doing so, they may create opportunities for collaboration and mutual growth.
Exactly, Julia. In addition, technology and digital tools, which countries use for influence and infrastructure, can also be applied to personal learning. For instance, using apps, online platforms, or podcasts for English practice can expand access to knowledge, connect learners with international communities, and support collaborative learning, which mirrors how digital infrastructure promotes global cooperation.
And we should also consider media literacy, because just as countries shape perceptions through narratives, individuals are constantly exposed to information online, in news, and through social media. Developing the ability to evaluate information critically, check sources, and understand context can help learners avoid misunderstandings and make more informed decisions in both English learning and daily life.
This also highlights the importance of reflection, which we practiced in earlier sections. Reflection allows learners to review new vocabulary, consider ideas carefully, and evaluate their own progress. And in real-world contexts, reflection helps individuals understand how their actions influence others, improve communication strategies, and make choices that foster cooperation and respect.
For English learners, this is a great opportunity to practice future tense, predictive language, and soft modals, because thinking about how you might apply these lessons can include sentences like, I might use polite expressions to improve communication. I could share knowledge to help classmates, or I may reflect on my daily interactions to understand their impact.
Exactly. Using predictive language in reflection allows learners to think critically while practicing English structures, and it also encourages a mindset where small actions today may lead to meaningful long-term effects, just as silent power operates gradually to influence countries over time.
It is also useful to note that cooperation and influence do not always require authority or formal power, because individuals can influence peers through consistency, helpfulness, clear explanations, and positive behavior, which mirrors the concept of soft power on a personal scale. Another takeaway is that challenges and competition can be constructive because peaceful competition encourages improvement, problem-solving, and creative thinking. And applying this in everyday life might mean striving to improve English skills, helping classmates, or collaborating on projects without feeling threatened or trying to dominate. Exactly. By combining reflection, vocabulary practice, awareness of perception, polite communication, adaptation, and constructive cooperation, learners can build stronger relationships, improve language skills, and approach challenges thoughtfully, which is essentially applying the principles of silent power on a personal level.
Finally, it is important to remember that progress is gradual, whether in language learning, personal relationships, or understanding global influence. Consistent effort, patience, curiosity, and reflection are the keys to developing competence, building trust, and making a meaningful impact over time. And this lesson aligns perfectly with the long-term strategies we discussed throughout this podcast.
To summarize, listeners can apply today's concepts in daily life by focusing on dialogue, cooperation, adaptation, media literacy, cultural understanding, sharing knowledge, and thoughtful reflection. By doing so, learners not only improve English, but also develop skills for collaboration, critical thinking, and personal influence in a globalized world.
By connecting international principles like diplomacy, silent power, innovation, and influence with everyday actions, learners can see the relevance of these ideas in practical contexts, practice English in meaningful ways, and gradually develop confidence in communication, comprehension, and analysis.
So, as we conclude this additional section, we encourage listeners to think about the small but significant ways they can influence others positively, practice patience and reflection, use vocabulary in context, and apply lessons from silent power in their own personal, academic, and professional lives, because these steps may lead to lasting growth in both language and understanding of the world.
Thank you for following this extended discussion. We hope that connecting global concepts with personal application inspires learners to practice English, engage thoughtfully, and consider influence, cooperation, and reflection in their daily experiences. By observing these principles patiently and consistently, learners may find that both their language and understanding of global dynamics improve steadily over time.
Remember, each interaction, choice, and reflection counts. Just as silent power shapes global relationships quietly and over time, small deliberate actions in personal life can create meaningful influence, build trust, and support positive outcomes. And this mindset will support learners as they continue practicing English and exploring the world around them.
Thank you once again for listening to the English Globe. We encourage you to practice today's vocabulary, reflect on the lessons shared, and continue building both your English skills and your understanding of global and personal influence.
Until our next episode, keep learning, stay reflective, and remember that understanding influence, both globally and personally, can help you communicate effectively, build strong relationships, and approach challenges thoughtfully while practicing English consistently. As we come to the final section of today's podcast, it is important to take some time to review the key vocabulary and concepts we have discussed, because revisiting words and expressions can help learners remember them more effectively. And by reflecting on these terms calmly, listeners can connect language learning with understanding how countries interact, influence each other, and manage relationships in ways that do not rely on conflict.
That is very true, Julia. And for our listeners, some of the most important words from today include silent power, influence, cooperation, diplomacy, partnership, adaptation, narrative, perception, infrastructure, innovation, and cultural exchange, and noticing how these words were used in context can help learners understand not only their meaning, but also the way they are applied in real discussions about global issues.
Let us consider a few examples carefully, because understanding words in context is often more effective than memorizing definitions alone. And for instance, the term silent power refers to the kind of influence that operates quietly through systems, culture, technology, or education, rather than through military force. And recognizing this distinction can help learners understand international relationships more clearly.
Similarly, words like cooperation and partnership emphasize long-term relationships built on mutual benefit and trust, and when we use them in sentences, it is useful to notice structures such as countries cooperate to address shared challenges, or long-term partnerships are created through trust and dialogue, which demonstrate formal, descriptive language suitable for academic or professional English.
Other terms, such as adaptation and innovation, are equally important, because adaptation describes how countries or people adjust to new situations, while innovation refers to the development of new ideas, methods, or technologies. And learners can practice using these words in simple sentences like, a country adapts its policies to global changes, or innovation may create new opportunities for cooperation.
Narrative and perception are also key concepts, because narratives explain how stories or repeated messages shape understanding, and perception describes how people interpret and think about events or countries. And by noticing examples such as media narratives influence public perception, learners can see how abstract nouns are used in clear and formal English.
As part of reflection, it is helpful to ask questions because questions encourage thinking, speaking, and connecting language with ideas. And listeners may consider questions like, how do countries use education and culture to build influence? Or, in what ways might technology create long-term partnerships between nations? These questions allow learners to practice forming answers in full sentences while reinforcing vocabulary.
Another reflection question might be, what role could diplomacy play in maintaining global balance in the future? And by thinking carefully and answering in their own words, learners can reinforce understanding of both content and language, because using words such as diplomacy, balance, cooperation, and influence in answers strengthens retention and comprehension simultaneously.
We can also reflect on personal connections, because learners might consider questions like, how can understanding silent power help me work or communicate with people from different countries? Or, what examples of long-term cooperation can I observe in my own community? By relating global concepts to personal experiences, learners enhance critical thinking while practicing English naturally.
In addition to reflection, it is important to encourage listeners to continue learning, because consistent practice, curiosity, and engagement with English content can significantly improve comprehension, speaking, and writing skills. And as we have modeled today, using clear explanations, descriptive sentences, and contextually relevant vocabulary can make complex topics accessible and memorable.
Listeners may also practice by summarizing the podcast aloud or in writing, because summarization reinforces comprehension, strengthens vocabulary recall, and encourages learners to organize ideas logically, and by trying to explain concepts like silent power, media influence, diplomacy, and technology in their own words, learners actively consolidate both language and knowledge.
For comprehension practice, learners might listen to a section again and identify key terms such as infrastructure, cultural exchange, peaceful competition, narrative, adaptation, and public perception, and then try to create their own sentences using these words, which allows them to reinforce meaning, spelling, pronunciation, and context simultaneously.
Finally, the main takeaway for our listeners is that learning English is not only about memorizing words, but also about understanding ideas, connecting language to global concepts, and practicing thoughtful reflection. Because combining vocabulary reinforcement, critical thinking, and speaking practice can significantly enhance both language proficiency and general knowledge.
So as we conclude today, we encourage all listeners to continue exploring English calmly, reflect on the ideas we discussed about silent power and global influence, review the vocabulary regularly, answer reflective questions, and use these words in their own sentences, because this method strengthens understanding, supports long-term retention, and makes learning both practical and enjoyable.
By integrating language practice with thoughtful reflection, learners can gradually improve comprehension, speaking, and critical thinking skills, while gaining a deeper understanding of international relationships. And as a final note, remember that learning is a process that grows with patience, curiosity, and consistent effort, and even small daily steps can lead to meaningful progress over time.
Thank you for joining us today on the English Globe, and we hope that today's discussion about silent power, diplomacy, technology, culture, and global influence has been educational, thought-provoking, and enjoyable. And we encourage listeners to continue practicing English by reflecting, using vocabulary in context, and exploring new topics with curiosity and calm focus.
We also invite our listeners to share their thoughts in the comments. Tell us which part they found most interesting, and describe how they might use today's vocabulary or ideas in their own learning. Because engaging actively with content strengthens understanding and helps make the journey of learning English both interactive and rewarding.
Remember, every new word, every reflective question, and every discussion about ideas builds both language skill and global awareness, and by practicing consistently, learners can feel confident in their ability to understand complex topics, explain ideas in English, and engage thoughtfully with the world around them.
So take your time, practice regularly, reflect thoughtfully, and enjoy the process of learning. Because over time, these small but consistent efforts may lead to a strong foundation in English, deeper understanding of international relations, and a more confident ability to communicate complex ideas clearly and calmly.
Thank you again for listening to the English Globe, and we look forward to continuing this journey together in future episodes, where we will explore more topics, reinforce important vocabulary, and help learners like you practice English in ways that are both meaningful and enjoyable.
Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and remember that language is not only a tool for communication, but also a bridge to understanding the world, its people, and the ideas that shape our shared future.